Welcome to this Chatham House discussion on whether China can still prosper under Xi Jinping. My name is Ben Bland. I'm the director of the Asia Pacific program here at Chatham House. We often talk at Chatham House and in the circles we move in about what Xi Jinping's leadership means for the world. But we spend a lot less time, at least in the UK, thinking about whether the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party is delivering for his primary audience, the 1.4 billion people of China. I think probably most of you here and watching online would be aware that Xi, General Secretary Xi, has amassed great power in the 12 years since he got the top job. He's eliminated many of his elite opponents. He's projected a much more strident foreign and security policy around the world, and he's helped China enhance its position as the world's factory floor and producer of some key emerging technologies like EVs, solar cells and the rest. We also know that economic growth in China has become sluggish. The private sector has been hobbled by repeated crackdowns which date almost from Xi Jinping's accession to power in 2012. Young people are frustrated by lack of quality jobs, especially for graduates, and Washington's intensifying efforts to contain China are definitely casting a long shadow over China's future. Earlier today, good timing for our discussion, the Chinese authorities also announced a range of stimulus measures to try and address the sluggish economic growth as well. And we're fortunate to have a really smart and insightful panel to address Xi Jinping's handling of these major challenges. So to my left is Desmond Shum. He's a businessman who had a seat at the high table of party politics, deal-making and corruption in China, and wrote about his experiences in the acclaimed memoir Red Roulette. Next to Desmond is Winnie King. She's a senior lecturer in Chinese international political economy at the University of Bristol. And lastly but not least, we have David Lubin, who is the Michael Klein Senior Research Fellow in our Global Economy and Finance program. So today's ground rules, I'm going to fire some questions at the panelists for about 35 or 40 minutes. Then I'll turn to questions from you in the audience here in person and online. If you have a question online, please use the Q&A function on Zoom, and I'll try and get to your questions. And just before we begin, I'd like to give a final reminder that this event is on the record. It is being live streamed, and we will be posting a recording online later. So Desmond, I'm going to come to you first. Given you had a seat at some of the highest tables where business and the business of politics was done in China, and just ask a really simple question. Do you think Xi Jinping is doing a good job for China?
I think it's, I think by now it's, I think probably the whole world is seeing China has really taken a different, we're taking a different trajectory since he came to power a decade ago. I think, we in China always say, he inherited a great hand, in poker game, so to speak. And then it's amazing how badly he has played his hand and then turn the country, take the country on a completely different trajectory.
And quick reflections on this question from you, Winnie and David, before we dig deeper.
I think it depends on what perspective you're looking from.
That's not an acceptable answer.
No, I haven't finished yet. I think from the perspective of what Xi Jinping has been trying to achieve for himself in establishing his position and consolidating his power, I think he's been quite successful. I think in terms of the international system's expectations of China and their initial expectations of what Xi Jinping would bring when he first came to power, from the international perspective, I think we're quite disappointed, mainly because there was a lot of hope that he would bring in reform, and he was much more liberal, and that's shown that not to be the case. So.
And David?
I mean, I think if the question is he doing as much as he can do for the welfare of Chinese households, the answer clearly is no, but I don't think that's the question he's asking himself. The question he's asking himself is, what can I do to promote the interests of the Chinese nation? And it's interesting that those two ideas are so separate in the Chinese context. And they're separate, I think, because of the way Xi Jinping feels himself to be encircled geopolitically. And so the economic policy is oriented around the need to protect China from geopolitical risk. And I think from that point of view, he probably thinks he's doing quite well. But household welfare becomes a sort of sideshow in that story.
We're going to come back both to those questions of kind of broader welfare of the Chinese people and the geopolitics, but I want to dig a bit deeper first into Xi Jinping the man? I mean, it strikes me that he's been one of the world's most prominent figures over the last 10, 12 years, but there's been so little insight, to be honest, into what drives him as a person, what kind of leader he is. I mean, we hear a lot about him amassing power, but Desmond, I mean, do you think that's just a sort of Machiavellian plan to advance his own sort of personal interests or personal agenda? Is there a kind of deeper ideology? Is there a vision there? What behind Xi Jinping's thinking? What do you think is driving him as a leader?
Yeah, I actually, on this specific question, I gave a lot of thought. I wrote a piece actually for myself 5 years ago, and I put it on my Twitter like a couple of days ago again. I think the first thing of the first and foremost, we really need to see him as a man of conviction and belief. I mean, he is a man of conviction and belief. And you're just seeing him purely as a power-hungry dictator, I think really missing the point. I mean, I think, you know, he has a vision. His vision for China is we need to be the primary geopolitical power rival to the US. He has a belief. He believes the Chinese Communist Party should be the eternal ruler of China as a nation. So I think that's the first point to see him. It's like he has belief and he has a conviction. You may not agree with his belief, you may not agree with his conviction, and then some of the worst tragedy of the humankind happened in history. People like Mao, like Hitler, like Stalin, those are men of belief. Those are the men, you know, and men of the belief can, you know, with the wrong kind, can do the most damage to humanity. And I tend to believe he's that sort. And in terms of like, well, I'll stop here actually.
Yeah. And I mean, digging a bit deeper then, Winnie, I mean, is he a communist or a Leninist Marxist? I mean, so we talk about how, you know, there's been a lot of pressure to, you know, reinforce ideology under Xi Jinping. What elements of sort of Marxism, Leninism, communism do you think that Xi Jinping A, believes in, and B, is trying to enact?
I think I would describe him more as a combination of a Marxist and a nationalist. And a lot of what he's trying to do, I would agree with Desmond in terms of the fact that he's a man of conviction in terms of what he wants to achieve for the Chinese nation. And the nationalism, the ideology side, plays a very big role in that. But I think the nationalism side is something that's very under-discussed in terms of not just the fact that, you know, with the global financial crisis in 2008, the Chinese, with their economy, was facing something fundamentally different than they had actually envisioned, because they were working within a system that was seen to be quite stable. And the global financial crisis demonstrated to the Chinese that there was actually something that didn't fit for them necessarily. And with that, shifts in the geopolitical arena, beginning with Trump, but actually not beginning with Trump, but even before Trump, with Obama's Asia pivot, growing efforts to militarily contain China, suggested to the Chinese leadership, to Xi Jinping, that the context of how the Communist Party was going to legitimize themselves and ensure their regime's security needed to be something that was multifaceted, more than just to do with ideology and the economy and economic strength and growth, but actually something that involved a much more multifaceted security basis. So, and all of that is very much rooted within the Marxist line and the nationalism line.
And David, how have you seen, I mean, you've been a market economist for a long time now, you're at Chatham House. How have you seen these kind of questions of Xi Jinping's style and ideology? How has that actually come out in his sort of real economic policy? Like, what do you see, you know, elements of Marxism there? I mean, or what elements do you see? What elements of nationalism? How do you understand sort of China's economy, particularly in relation to other kind of large, fast-growing emerging markets?
When you went for Marxism and nationalism, I'm going to go for Leninism, in the sense that, you know, it seems fairly clear that Xi Jinping is an ideological leader. But the way one needs to understand ideology in this context is to understand it in a Leninist way. In other words, it's not a pure set of ideas. It's the set of ideas that's needed to keep the ruling party in power. That is, you know, quintessentially a Leninist approach, and I think that's his approach. And the effect of that on economic policy is evident in the change in the balance of power under Xi's leadership between state-owned enterprises and the private sector. Starting in 2015, 2016, you got this sense that the economic policy was emphasizing the idea of bigger, better, stronger state-owned enterprises, and the state sector, the sort of balance of relevance, if you like, between the state sector and the private sector started to tilt from that, from that time on. Particularly at the 19th Party Congress in 2017, this concept of state-owned enterprise reform and promoting the interest and the relevance of state-owned enterprises became much more important. Then in 2021, so you had, first of all, the sort of promotion of state-owned enterprise, and then in 2021 you had the sort of crushing of the private sector. So the whole thing happened in a sort of chronology. And in 2021, I think, the most relevant or most important sort of policy phrase, policy slogan in this context was this sort of struggle against the unrestrained expansion of capital. The idea that, the private sector was taking advantage of its position, was doing things that were not in the national interest, or certainly not in the national interest as the party saw it. And so this sort of attempt to kind of crush the unrestrained expansion of capital, the crackdown on the private education industry, on the gaming industry, on Jack Ma, was all sort of part of this effort that by the end of 2021 led to a proposal which I think died a death, but it was a very interesting proposal and it was a good reflection of policy thinking at the time. The proposal in December 2021 was to create a traffic light system. And the idea was that the party would decide what kind of investment was good, what kind of private sector investment was good, got a green light, what kind of private sector got a red light. And so you got this sense that the insertion of party into the allocation of private sector resources was becoming much more evident. And so this is all about what it takes to keep the party in power, and that I think is quintessentially a Leninist approach.
Yeah, so we've had Leninism, Marxism. I won't go into whether he's a Menshevik or a Bolshevik. We can leave that for another day. But Desmond, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, just one thing to add. I agree with David. It's very, I think it's a Leninist system. I think two things I want to say here. One is the party interest comes first. I mean, national interest, how do you define national interest? It's fussy. I mean, even you ask party member, how you define national interest, I would say Xi Jinping probably had a very different definition from previous administration. So that's a fussy one. That's not equivalent that party interest and national interest are the same thing. The second thing is actually come back to Winnie's point earlier. In my experience, 2008, the financial crisis is a watershed moment for modern Chinese history, especially the last 15 years. That's the moment that it's not they realize that West model doesn't fit them. It's they see the failing of the Western model, and that changed everything. Because at that moment, before that, the discussion within China, it was, we are moving that direction. The only question is different people have different opinion at what pace are we moving. We are moving the direction of capitalism. We are moving the direction of democracy. Even today, they are not dropping the democracy under Xi Jinping, the term, although the liberal, they define it any way they wanted to. But that was the direction. The entire country would agree with that. What happened in the financial crisis, what we see what's happening is that basically the entire Western democracy are in desperation. And people are looking at the moment, I was looking to China, say, are Chinese going to hold their currency? If they don't hold their currency, if they do a round of devaluation, and then you will lead to another new round of devaluation across Asia, and we don't know where's the end of that. So and then Wen Jiabao stood firm and come out with the 4 trillion revitalization plan, and then stabilize the entire situation. So the world see China as a hero, rescuing world, so to speak, in an extent. And that's the moment that the leadership really think it's like, hey, their system is not that great. Our system may not be that bad. We need to find our own way. And that's the moment like everything changes since then. I mean, in terms of like the state enterprise advancing and private enterprise forced to retreat, it started in 2008. It started even before Xi Jinping. I mean, I have a company, like I have a joint venture with the Capital Airport Group, which is the biggest airport group in China. They own 40 airports. And I have, after that, I have a party cell installed in my enterprise. I have party secretary assigned to my company, and I need to have dialogues, with the party organization within my company. I was the CEO. And so you are already feeling that, already seeing, well, whoa, things are changing. So it really starts before Xi Jinping, and then obviously when Xi Jinping came, it brings it to another pace, and then then we are developing a different story.
And what's been the reaction? Because as you say, this crackdown on the private sector, it predates Xi Jinping. It definitely intensified very early on when he came to power. We saw, the heads of organizations like Fosun, Anbang, and others sort of disappearing, sometimes reappearing, sometimes reappearing in prison. I was a Financial Times journalist in Hong Kong when Xiao Zhenhua was kidnapped and taken across the border. I mean, is this personal for Xi Jinping? Does he see these sort of tycoons as people challenging his authority? Is it more ideological? And then the other part of it is, how has that affected the kind of attitudes of the private sector in China? Because it's been almost a decade.
If I talk from my experience, what happened was by the second term of Wen Jiabao Hu Jintao time, so 5 years previous with Xi Jinping's time, the discussion was already the country is going more diverse. You have the commercial elites, business people having the success. We are all building NGOs. We all set up NGO because we sort of, the way we're copying the Western model. Like we want to spend money. We are the generation that we want to push the society to a direction we think it's really integrating with the rest of the world. You are seeing, political figures, obviously, in my book I talk about it. It's like how they profiteer from the development economy. And they sort of, each one have a whole, commercial interest in different spheres. And so you're seeing a diffusion of political power throughout a society. And that is a problem from the party. And everybody, not all the entire leadership sees that as a problem. But people are not sure what to do about it. So we were at the time in Beijing, there was this talk like 击鼓传花. So essentially, this music game, that's the music play, everybody run around, and the music stops, somebody's going to run out of a chair. And then, so what this discussion in Beijing is like, who's rich leader, future leader will be, holding, not going to getting a chair. And so that was a discussion. It's like, we know there's a problem, but how to deal with it? Does anybody have the guts to deal with it? To the extent that bring the heavy hand onto it, and it doesn't seem to be. And that was the mood in Beijing.
Yeah. And to what extent then, Winnie, and then maybe David after that, do you think this crackdown has killed the animal instincts of China's economy? Because we know that these Chinese private sector large conglomerates were really a key to Chinese growth numbers, but also some of the most dynamic tech companies that came out of China profited in this period when they had huge leeway to do whatever they wanted. So to what extent do you think the crackdown is responsible for kind of sluggish growth and lack of opportunities that younger people are feeling in China?
Okay, so you have two main questions in that then. First would be the response or the feeling of the major tech companies, for instance, and then the second question would be the general population, such as students, right? So with the first one, I would say, given how, it's complicated, given how the state has particularly targeted innovation, tech, artificial intelligence as a key driver for the Chinese economy, it offers two kind of contrary things that create tensions. One is the fact that, yes, you are concerned about whether or not the Chinese state will react negatively to the kind of economic strategies and economic decisions that you make for your company. One of the main problems you had, for instance, with Jack Ma or Pony Ma was it was the idea that these individuals began to see, whether or not they saw themselves this way, but definitely within the international economy and within Western powers and Western elites, to be seen as bigger or beyond the party state. And that's particularly problematic if, the main goal is to ensure that the party state maintains hold over the reins of power and influence in decision making. And so there is that kind of problem in terms of whether or not they can act freely. But the emphasis on these sectors by the Chinese government in terms of the level of investment that's going in, them becoming the major priority for the next stage of the Chinese economy, also provides support, right? So it just depends on what it is you want out of it, right? I would say that and I guess David says at the very beginning, is what it means for the general population. However, it becomes that's the key question. There are significant programs and levels of investment in certain areas, such as with regards to the civil economy, for redressing issues and sectors, to retrain individuals or workers that are in sectors that are no longer able to work at capacity anymore because of issues of overcapacity. The extent to which that feeds into consumption, into developing robust and effective services sector is another question. But China's demographic issues obviously feeds into all of this, become things that for a nation of 1.4 billion people is not something that we can resolve easily. I mean, South Korea has announced that they have the lowest ever level of fertility, and it's something that's occurring across the developed world. So yeah.
Low productivity, and also wondering how we control our uber powerful tech tycoons who are bigger than our governments. Also a common problem. And David, I mean, what does the kind of economic evidence bear out then about the causes for China's slowdown? Because there are so many factors that people talk about.
Yeah.
Is it possible to sort of have a hierarchy of causation?
Yes, I mean, I think that at the top of that hierarchy is the determined effort that Chinese policymakers are making to wean the economy off of its dependence on real estate investment. Real estate investment had come to account for some 30% of GDP, and the project to reduce the Chinese economy's dependence on real estate investment, I think, is the central goal, or a central goal, of Chinese policymaking, and goes a long way to explain certainly why the level of confidence among Chinese households is so weak, and to some extent also goes to explain why the level of confidence among Chinese firms is so weak. There are a couple of ways of thinking about what they're trying to do. I mean, from a purely economic point of view, it's just crazy that 30% of your eggs are in this basket. In other words, to diversify the economy away from dependence on real estate makes all sorts of sense in a pure economic framework. But there's a kind of geopolitical element to what's going on, which is that I think that what's really at work here is an effort to reduce the economy's dependence on real estate investment in order to allow capital and credit resources to flow to sectors of the economy that the authorities consider more relevant today, namely high-tech, green energy, and all of the investment that's required to turn China into what they themselves describe as a manufacturing powerhouse. And from that point of view, and you can see, the investment in real estate has gone down over the last 4 years, investment in manufacturing has gone up. So from that point of view, the project is successful. And indeed, China accounts for 35% of global manufacturing. The G7 as a whole accounts for way less than 30%. So from that point of view, the strategy has been incredibly successful. But it does, as I say, you have to kind of carve up the way you analyze the Chinese economy, because certain sectors of the economy are really unhappy and certain sectors of the economy are doing quite well. As for the private sector as a whole, I would say, to answer your original question, animal spirits are really, for the most part, very weak indeed. A couple of ways of looking at that or making that point First of all, the demand for credit is kind of on the floor. The growth rate of credit has been collapsing for quite some time. But in a way, more strikingly, when you look at foreign direct investment flows in and out of China, what we have now is a situation where the net outflow of foreign direct investment in the last 12 months is about $200 billion. $200 billion of real capital has left China. That's more than 1% of Chinese GDP. There are different ways of explaining that net outflow of FDI. To some extent, it's kind of China Inc. trying to embark on a sort of project of geopolitical arbitrage. You know, Chinese facing sanctions or facing tariffs. You want to find manufacturing locations that are less at risk of tariff actions on the part of the US or the EU. So some of it's sort of geopolitical arbitrage, you know, relocating manufacturing capacity to deal with tariff risk. But I think a lot of it is just capital voting with its feet. And so, you know, that's a good bit of evidence, I think, that animal spirits in the private sector are weak. Now, of course, you do have some bright spots. You know, the most obvious are what are called the three new electric vehicles, lithium batteries, solar panels. And in general, exports are a real bright spot of the Chinese economy. I mean, the growth rate of export volumes at the moment is around 10% year on year. When you sit that against the fact that global import growth is less than zero, you can see how Chinese exporters are capturing global market share, which in a way is exactly the point. It is exactly the strategy that they're trying to achieve, in the sense that, you know, the broad strategy, I think, or a way of describing the broad strategy, is a Chinese effort to simultaneously, on the one hand, reduce China's dependence on the rest of the world through import substitution, while at the same time trying to make the rest of the world more dependent on China. And so that capturing of global market share through creating this trade powerhouse, this manufacturing powerhouse, is a core element of what they're trying to do. And from that point of view, they're doing it quite well.
And where do you think this goes then, Desmond? I mean, do you think China can sort of continue pushing towards these new productive forces without, you know, unleashing the animal instincts of the private sector? Can Xi Jinping kind of keep the private sector in a box, you know, have more state control and keep, you know, developing these new technologies and these new productive capacities? Or do you think, you know, there comes a point at which he's going to run out of road there?
Well, several things I would like to add. First of all, I was a real estate developer. I built a third of the Beijing airport. I have hotels, office, apartment buildings in Beijing. I think the real estate sector, I mean, sort of taming the real estate sector, has been sort of like wishes of the previous administration before Xi Jinping too. But because the society, as David was saying, relies so much on real estate, and nobody has to have the sort of guts to tank it. And but I think Xi Jinping has the wish to tame it down, but his heavy-handed approach and his, may I use the word stupidity, because he didn't know the severity of the consequence of his heavy-handed approach, push it down so much that now it becomes a major problem, right? When you have 90% of the residents own their own homes, 80% of the private wealth are tied up in real estate. When you tank that thing to the extent it's tanking now, that's a huge problem. I think the wealth effect is just playing out now. I mean, this is very early stage of the wealth effect playing out. And then the second thing is the animal spirit. I think the first three, I left China 2015, 2016, because I seeing things are going different way. And I'm just as an example of private entrepreneurs, because I think some people see it later, some people see it a little bit earlier. The biggest problem today in today's China, it's not the stimulus plan they just came out today. that's not going to cure the thing. The problem in China today is a political problem. It's how, they have been pushing down on the private entrepreneurs for the past decade. You give some lip service, say, oh, basically, what did he say? We treat private entrepreneur as a family member. Then the way we read it is that, okay, you treat us as a family member, so we are not actually a family member, right? I mean, really, literally, that's what's happening. So he has beating on the head for the whole decade now. Now you say, well, we need you. It's like we're like you look at it, this stimulus package is not going to really, you will have the market jump a little bit, in the market jump 4% today, but it doesn't take, didn't kill the root cause of the issue. Is people don't have the confidence. You can do this today, you can tomorrow, who knows what you're going to do, right? And then we got, a lot of people got disappeared, right? Jack Ma got disappeared for 4 weeks. I got a friend, who is the banker for the tech industry. He is still disappeared. More than a year now, right? And the reason I published my book is because my wife got disappeared for 4 years, right? When you have this kind of things, and then this is just examples so that I can go on with the list. Then if you're a private entrepreneur, it's like, what, definitely I'm voting with my feet, and it's like, hey, if I can get money out, the first thing, if I'm gonna have capital, the first thing is how can I get my money out? Yeah. Nobody's gonna say, well, how can I invest more? So the problem with China's the economy is a political issue. The stimulus plan today maybe help for the next few weeks, maybe help a quarter. It's not gonna much beyond that. So that's the bigger problem of China. Is that I think the private entrepreneur, which account for 50% of the economy, has no confidence and no belief in this administration. We talk about with my friends. We're like, the biggest rescue for the China is somebody give Xi Jinping a bullet in the head. The market gonna jump. The market gonna really gonna jump tomorrow.
That's obviously not a Chatham House view, to be clear. David, I'm not going to ask you about that, but I mean, on this broader question of whether China can innovate, with this more controlled model. I mean, I guess Xi Jinping would say, "Great, I'm glad people like Desmond have left. I'm glad you're feeling the pain. You were all just, stealing our money and exploiting the people. We're going to have this state-led tech development. Everyone wants our EVs. Everyone wants our batteries." Sorry, let me just come to David first. What's your sense on, can they keep going? Because, a lot of people in the West have repeatedly bet against, China's ability. And, as the state's taken more control, they've still succeeded in a lot of areas economically.
Yeah, I mean, I think it probably reflects the fact that we don't know much about what constitutes innovation, what is the basis for innovative economy. Because, if you just look at the domination of Chinese EV manufacturers of that industry, yes, you can argue that they've benefited hugely from industrial subsidies. And for sure, those have been an important part of the story of how China's EV industry came to dominate the rest of the world. But it's surely not just about subsidies. You can subsidize till you're blue in the face, but if you don't have the actual skills and capability and willingness and innovative capacity, then it won't deliver any results, and this clearly has. And so I think that one of the reasons why trade conflict is now sewn in to China's relationships with the rest of the world, and the rest of the world needs to be defined very broadly. What occupies most people's attention is trade conflict between China and the United States, trade conflict between China and EU, but it's important to bear in mind that China's the most rapidly growing part of China's trade surplus is with developing countries. Developing countries now account for about half of China's trade surplus, and that's not been true in the past. And what you also see when you look at hostile trade policies implemented against China, what you see is that the fastest growing source of trade policy hostility towards China is not coming from the G7, it's coming from emerging economies. And so, you've got this kind of optimistic view that, if Brazil, say, can import tons of cheap solar panels, then that should create the conditions for a manufacturing revival in Brazil. maybe that's true. I think it's a bit too optimistic. I think the reality that we're actually seeing is that more and more developing countries are becoming irritated with this effort that China is making worldwide to dominate global manufacturing. And so, yeah, they're very successful at it, and I think we shouldn't underestimate China's innovative, the combination of China's innovative capacity plus the economics of subsidization. But in a way, what seems to be a very clear short-run success should be questioned in the longer term, because it induces so much hostility towards China from both developed and developing countries.
Okay, Winnie, and then I'll come back to you, Desmond.
I think David makes a really good point. Xi Jinping's one of the main things he talks about when it comes to China's economy and how he envisions China's place in the world economy is basically trying to create this world factory, right? And I think that and I mean that's one of the things that I really wanted to highlight was that when we talk about the world, we tend to talk about the G7, but China's relationship with the developing world and emerging markets are fundamental in terms of not just where China's efforts to diversify its markets, its market access, and its supply chains have a central role. The Belt and Road Initiative is one key way in which it's done that, right? I mean, we can talk about overcapacity in steel and infrastructure and all that kind of stuff, but when it comes to the digital Silk Road and the role that telecommunications, for instance, has played in undersea cables kind of agreements and production has played a role in basically locking in China's place in China's relationship with these growing economies, and obviously then as they develop, future consumers, right? That's something that cannot be underestimated in terms of helping China achieve the things it wants to do for its economy. I think on the flip side of that is also the fact that we're rather than just looking at emerging economies and developing economies as just kind of the recipient of Chinese investment or goods, is also the fact that the BRICS Plus nations are increasingly becoming major investors in China itself, as there's gaps left behind by the G7 nations, as companies and conglomerates start to leave. So that kind of investment going into China also not only embeds the relationships and the kind of geopolitics that's going on in the shift away from a pure G7 neoliberal kind of economy, but into potentially the establishment of new multilateral economic organizations, which potentially elevate China's role within the international system. So.
Desmond.
Yeah, I think the situation is, I've been downbeat on China for a long while now. It's because like so many it's like a perfect storm. So many negative factors are coming in at the same time. Yes, there is no news read, and as David was mentioning, but news read is 6% of the GDP. How much you can grow? How much you can grow to replace the real estate sector, which was 30%, like upstream and downstream together, it's about 30% of the economy. When that has go into a major contraction, you have a 6% growing, right? Okay, how does that replace anything? So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is also as David was mentioned, the China is now about just over 30% of global manufacturing. Yes, your labor need to feed their household, and then what about the rest of the world? How much more market share you can take, and you already want a third of global manufacturing, with less than 15% of global population, about 15% of global GDP. How much more market share you can take? And then you put in geopolitical situation with Europe and all that, and also I was just looking at the list, the top 10 foreign country investor in China. Like China essentially led by the Americans, and then Japan I think came in third. I think like China is having political issue with all your major investors. In China, we're looking at that. We're talking like, if you run a firm, you're in trouble with every one of your major accounts. are your firm going to survive? Right? I mean, how can you run a firm like offending every one of your major accounts? How does that work? So I think it is a perfect storm. We haven't even started on the population issue and all of those things. So it's a perfect storm. It's right now.
But how do you see that playing out? Because obviously there's very few signs. There's no signs of sort of elite dissent. There's very few signs of sort of widespread popular dissent. We know that obviously the information environment in China is very controlled. That's a given. So how do you see this playing out? Because again, if we look back in recent history, people predicting the collapse of the CCP haven't got a very successful career, right?
Well, I think first of all, I think two things. One is I don't believe this like collapse. Collapse is the wrong word. I think the concept to look at it's a long decline. I don't see, because CCP has such a hold, such a complete hold on the country and throughout the society and the economy and this ruthlessness, and then modern technology. You read on the newspaper all the time how much monitoring is going on in China, and then you have the Great Wall of China completely controlling information in and out of China. I think it's a bit of a long decline. Collapse is really a wrong word. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think earlier I used the word stupidity because Xi Jinping really set himself up. Back in 2015, I was one of the reasons I was leaving China was. Back in 2015, you can say, you can see he's not going to get out. It's not like he doesn't want to come out. Even if he wants to, he cannot get off the front line. Because it's like riding the tiger, right? And by now, he arrested, 5 million bureaucrats. Arrest and punish 5 million bureaucrats. These are the people who previously have a hold on power. You figure like if each have 5, 6 close associates, parents, brothers and sisters, people who they were protege of somebody had grooms, their close colleague, relative. Let's say, one person have 5 close people. That's 20 million people have agendaed against you. How the heck are you going to get off the, yes, you look fantastic, you're riding the tiger and then say, I'm going to punch this guy, I'm going to punish that guy. But the moment you try to get off, when you get off, the backlash coming back, it's going to be tremendous. Like even by 2015, he already done 1 million people. How the hell are you going to get off the tiger? It's just no way. So I think that what's going to happen is as the economy go down, the sort of his crawl, the control is more and more dictatorial. It's more control. He's going to strangle the society because that's the only way. Because he's so afraid of like somebody gonna overthrow me. Because when this backlash if it comes, it will be so severe and it's not just him. It's like everybody who he's close associate gonna go down. That's how the China politics works. It's never a single person. It's always a cleansing. Why? Because all your close associates gonna go down with you.
So I'm going to come to question 6. One very quick fire question for you all. Given all this, do you think Xi Jinping will still be in power after 2 more party congresses? So say after 2032 in whatever it is, 8 years time. Do you think he'll still be in power? Just a yes or no? Yes. David?
Yes.
No.
So you say 10 years from now?
8 years after 2 more party congresses.
8 years from now? I don't know. I mean, it's hard to tell.
Okay, so a yes and a no and a hard to tell. All right.
The full spectrum.
Yes.
No, because I think what's going to happen is by next term, well, right now he's like just over 70. By next term, by the end of this term, he's close to 75. And what's going to happen is he's not going to destiny. In the past, we all we know ahead of that who are the top 2 guys of the administration, right? I mean, because they are in the Politburo, they groom from them for a decade. What he's gonna do I think by the next term is instead of like 2 guys designated, he's gonna have like 5, 6 guys. No, not 5, 6 over 2, like 3, 4 guys. So he will keep you. I will have some succession plan in place because I'm 75, but I will keep you guessing which one will be the top guy. Because the moment in China politics, the moment like who knows, like it's obvious who's going to be successor. Allegiance sway. like change hand, because I cannot get close to Xi Jinping. Then I'm gonna pledge my allegiance early to the next guy, and hopefully by the time he comes up, I'm gonna be in favor. So he doesn't want that to happen too early. So he's gonna have like 2, 3, 4 guys, as all sort of designated possible successors, and then he's gonna play that game.
Yeah. So
I kind of want to copy on my. The main reason I said no is because, number one, because of age. 2 is because you asked the question as to whether or not he would still be in a position. I think, if anything, he'd be more like a Deng Xiaoping, where he would still have his fingers in the pie, yeah, but not necessarily maintaining the position.
So president of the Chinese Ping Pong Association or something, controlling things in the background.
Football,
yeah, it would be football for Xi Jinping. Okay, great. Well, I'm going to come to your questions now, so please just put your hand up, and it will tell us who you are and any affiliation, and please make sure it's a question, not a statement. So yeah, I'll start there at the front. So just wait one sec for the microphone.
Damien Chunlal, I used to run Merrill Lynch Asia Pacific. My question is, 20 years ago, China, consumption was being encouraged, the economy, everyone was saying sort of push the economy, the private sector was doing really well, elements of, some protectionism, but elements of conversion. Obviously now it's very different. We're picking national winners. The private sector in some strategic areas has been crushed. My question is this: it's very hard for outsiders, even people in Hong Kong, to feel this. What are the private householders, these middle-class households have done very well over the last 50 years or so? What do they really feel? How do they feel in China? Are they happy? Are they not happy? What do they feel about the administration?
Who wants to take that? Desmond, do you want to take that? Winnie?
I mean, if you listen to all the story, nobody is happy. I mean, it's why you reporter, you read, you almost like these days, you open every newspaper, you talk about, they call it ping tea, downgrading the consumption, right? Everybody, and then you can see that whether, there's a lot of, high restaurants, listed restaurants, luxury goods listed. You look at even like LVMH. Right, I mean, across the board, all the luxury house really got downgraded. But you look at LVMH, like the results, it's China. Like everywhere else, it's like either like Europe has been fat, America grows a little bit, China is like major down, right? And so you can see that it's in a situation like that. And then you look at the housing market. The housing market, tier 1 city is down 20 to 30%. And then tier 2, tier 3 is like major down. Some of them like 50% down or more. How can anybody be happy in this kind of situation when most of the wealth, I was talking about 80% of the household wealth tied up in housing.
Okay, next question. Maybe there in the middle? Yeah.
Thank you. Thomas Apostolou. I'm just an international relations student at the School of Oriental and African Studies. Over the summer, I was working at the United Nations, just an internship, and I sat in on a WTO TPR meeting, and a Chinese diplomat said something very interesting. He said, China will always be a developing country. And we just spoke earlier about innovation and development, and I was wondering what the panel thinks about how China's placing themselves on the international stage, and if they're saying they will always be a developing country, how are they seeing themselves in 10 to 20 years? And when they joined the WTO in 2001, could you have predicted now that they would be saying that they want to be a developing country forever? Thank you.
It's interesting. China's part of this G77 group of developing countries, but they call it G77 plus China, which is interesting. So it's both in and out. So Schrodinger's developing country. But David, do you take this one?
It's a super interesting question because it exposes this kind of dilemma that China has. On the one hand, China's bid to establish itself as an alternative pillar of global order relies on its ability to sell itself as a spokesperson of the developing world. So identifying itself as a developing country is a hugely important source of international global legitimacy for the CCP. But at the same time, the second centenary goal for 2049, without question, is that China will be a fully developed economy and a major superpower. And there's a kind of intermediate goal of 2035, by which time, I can't remember the exact phrase, but the 2035 goal certainly indicates, to me at least, that China doesn't see itself at that stage, which isn't that far away, as a developing country anymore. So the one thing that it kind of needs to shore up, in other words, its status as a developing country in order to maintain this sort of magnet for other developing countries, that magnet will weaken over time, according to China's own plans. And so how it manages that dilemma, how it manages the sort of geopolitical consequences of it no longer being able to claim that it's a developing country, very interesting.
Can I just add to that? I think there's something to come when you're a developed economy. With that comes a certain expectation with regards to your responsibilities within the international system. The extent to which you come in for bailouts, the extent to which you're willing to take on military action, like all those kinds of things. And so with regards to foreign policy, that becomes problematic from the Chinese leadership's line of being a developed economy.
Do you have any questions from women? Because I want to be a bit more diverse than China's Politburo. Not to put pressure on, but it'd be great if there are any. In the meantime, one at the front.
John Wilson, I'm a journalist and a member of Chatham House. My question is this: what effect will be caused to China's economy when it attacks Taiwan in order to subjugate that nation?
Okay, who wants to take this when or if question?
So what was the question again? Sorry.
What happens to Chinese
economy?
Okay.
David, do you want to go? You're an economist. I mean, forget the when maybe, but
yeah,
if.
I think the answer is so beyond economics that it's, I'll have a go, but don't rely on anything I say. I mean, I think the consequences of any effort to integrate Taiwan into the PRC, you know, it's potentially an event of global conflict. And so, you know, the reason I kind of think that this is just beyond economics, in other words, trying to isolate the answer, you know, what is the effect of that effort on the Chinese economy? It's difficult to isolate it because we're you know, that scenario is one in which we're in kind of just untold consequences for the global economy, untold consequences for, you know, certainly the G7's hostility towards China. And so I think I mean, the economic consequences for China in the very short run, in the immediate term, I think would be extremely bad. In the longer term, if you accept the scenario that Chinese occupation of Taiwan might be the precursor to some, you know, global conflict, understanding the economic consequences of that, I think, are beyond us all.
Question at the front here.
Thank you very much. Omer Kokuchuri, founder of Africa Sustainable Development Board. Thank you so much. It's an interesting discussion. In a way, the panel touched this question closer to my heart, which embraces the diaspora. The African diaspora, we don't know the way forward. Just to a layman, what kind of things you want us to pick from here with the relationship with China and the international collaboration altogether? Thank you.
So you mean what lessons are there for China's engagement with Africa?
I wouldn't say it that way, but the international collaboration altogether, because a lot of African countries currently, they're embracing China in a lot of ways. And we are not supposed, more importantly, diaspora, we need to be careful we are not lost in the mix, because we also have a sustainable development forward. Thank you.
Does anyone want to talk about China, Africa?
Just, I guess, briefly, I'd say the key thing that we see happening with the Chinese and Africa, I mean, China and African nations have a very long history. And it's not just linked to economics, it's ideological, you could call it a brotherhood of a certain sort. And I think when it comes to how China has been engaging with developing economies, but in particular the continent of Africa, it represents an opportunity for African nations to decide for themselves and to use their agency, whether it has to do with their resources, whether it has to do with their own consumer markets and their labor force, for what African nations want out of trade, out of the economy for themselves. I think the Chinese have demonstrated a willingness to negotiate and see African nations as equals, and it's something that's quite different than we have with, I'm going to say something quite controversial, African nations and former colonial powers. So I think the history of the non-alignment movement, the history of the commonality in terms of seeing each other as developing economies, does have that potential benefit for African nations, as long as the leaderships are willing to be strong in taking that position.
I think the issue. I think one of the issue African countries. I mean, not just African, developing country need to sort of. Every country is different, but it's to judge for themselves. It's how much you do planned economy and how much you do laissez-faire free market, because China is all about now it's more about like central planning, right? I mean so they always like 集中力量办大事, so we concentrate our resources and then do the big deals, but this is not China. I mean, it's all this like Japan did that before that, Taiwan did that, Korea did that, all this. So this is not a model China invented. China is just the latest example of that. But so it's a balancing between how much I sort of centralize the resources and do the centralized planning and direct the nation's development, and then how much I let the free economy come into play. And so that's a very tricky thing. It's hard to balance, but I think that is really a lot of times China say, well, this is our model, but that's really not the China model. China is just the latest example, as I was saying. Japan, Korea. All these Asian countries have done that, as they cry out, come into to be a developed economy. So, but it's for the African countries, I think for developing countries, well, how do you pick the balance? And that is a balance to be paid. I mean, it's a free market, obviously, completely free market doesn't work when for a poor nation, but a completely planned economy doesn't work. Where do you strike that balance in between?
Okay, great. We've got time for just one final question. Yeah, here at the front.
I'm Jess. I'm a tech investor and member at Chatham House. I have a question just on the kind of trust or lack of trust that exists between like the private sector and, say, state institutions, and how far can we really interpret the crackdown that we've seen from Xi as just one man's ideology versus actually when you have capitalism built on very fragile institutional foundations, entrepreneurs, including your book, as you described, Desmond, unwilling to put 100% in one basket, right? And always thinking, how can I protect myself within this really fragile system? And so I guess my question is two parts. One is, can we think about this as Xi, or is this a larger kind of institutional question? And then second part, what are the institutions that you would like to see to kind of build some of that trust in a more stable way for a kind of more robust capitalist state relationship?
Yeah, you got nice constructive way to end the conversation, but you got 2 minutes.
I don't know if today
fix China's economy.
In today's China, I got anything nice constructive way to end a conversation. I think first of all, it's definitely not Xi. I mean, if you just look at I talked about earlier that the pushing the private sector back, and it starts from before Xi. And then another evidence or example of that, if you look at the wealth management business, it's Hong Kong, where does money come from? It's all essentially a capital threat from China. Today is because, and then you look at recent example, like how does Singapore now? It's like flying off the wealth management is all the money come out of China. It's like first stop is like we want to get away from the parties, the crawl of the party. So we go to Hong Kong. Now the party extends itself to Hong Kong. All the money now is flying to Singapore. That's why you see Singapore like really flying off. So there is no trust. And I don't see how that, and then it's a system issue, right? And then sometimes this party is more relaxed about it. Well, obviously now it's a different phase, and then it's other type. So, as we as an entrepreneur, always, I always think like, as long as my money is in China, it's not really my money. The moment my money is out of China, that's my money.
All right, well, thanks, and thanks to everyone for joining us today, and please join me giving a round of applause to our great panelists today. Thanks so much.